grief has a sound. Not crying. Crying is the sound of grief after it has found a container. The sound I mean is earlier than that, the sound before the container. A held breath, a particular quality of stillness in a hallway. The way a room of people goes collectively careful when someone inside it has just received news that will restructure the rest of their life. I had learned to recognize that sound in a surgical recovery wing in Fort Sam Houston in 2017, working nights beside men and women who were waking up to find out what the last few hours had cost them. I had learned to recognize it, and to walk toward it rather than away from it, and to do something useful with my hands when I got there. That skill did not appear anywhere on my nursing license. It did not appear anywhere on the job posting for the orthopedic surgery floor at Hargrove Memorial Hospital, which is where I had been working for 8 months, unremarkably, under the supervision of a team of nurses who had known each other for years and who had developed, over those years, the specific collective warmth of a group that does not need anyone new and is not going to pretend otherwise. They thought I was a transfer from a military facility who hadn't learned how real hospitals work. Too stiff, too strange, too quiet to trust, and too competent to like. Then Colonel James Aldridge walked off the elevator at 11 on a Wednesday morning and said 4 words into the orthopedic nurses station that rearranged the last 8 months in about 30 seconds. I don't want to ruin the 4 words by telling them to you now. Let me tell you how we got there first. My name is Diane Pruitt. I am 44 years old, and I have been a nurse for 20 years, 16 of them in Army hospitals, the last 4 in the civilian system that the Army hospitals had not entirely prepared me for. Not because the medicine was different, because the culture was different. In an Army hospital, the hierarchy is explicit, rank is visible, authority is assigned, and everyone understands exactly where they stand and why. In a civilian hospital, the hierarchy is implicit, which means it is everywhere and nowhere, encoded in small gestures and break room seating, and the particular way that certain nurses respond to certain questions from certain colleagues, and it took me approximately 3 weeks at Hargrove Memorial to understand that I had stepped into a room that had already finished arranging itself without me, and was not planning to rearrange. The orthopedic surgery floor at Hargrove Memorial smells like the specific antiseptic warmth of post-surgical recovery. Not the sharp chemical cold of pre-op, but something that has been applied and metabolized, that lives now in the linens and the room air and the breath of patients who are working through the first stage of putting themselves back together. The corridor carpet, orthopedics has carpet, which most floors do not. A concession to patient mobility and the sound of crutches muffles the foot traffic and gives the wing a quality of domestic quiet that the ER and the IQ do not have. The nurse's station is at the center of the wing, round, glassed on 3 sides, and serves as the social center of the floor in a way that the nurses' stations of other units do not. Which means it is always occupied, and always has been, and there is always someone positioned at it who sees everyone who comes and goes. I was not usually that someone to the orthopedic surgery floor team. I was the transfer who hadn't fit. To me, it was a waiting room of a different kind. A room where the patients were in the middle of recovery rather than the middle of crisis. Where the margin for intervention was measured in days rather than seconds. Where the job was sustained attention rather than immediate response. I had trained for immediate response. Sustained attention was something I was learning to be good at in a new way, and I had not finished learning it, and the people around me had not been patient with the unfinished part. Sandra Kovacs had been a nurse at Hargrove Memorial for 11 years. She was the senior clinical nurse on the orthopedic floor, which was not a formal title, but was an understood one. The distinction between a charge nurse's administrative authority and the kind of authority that 11 years of shared history bestow on a person, which is harder to define, and more durable. She was excellent at her job. She was also the specific kind of excellent that has organized itself around a particular way of doing things, and she had not received me as a colleague. She had received me as a variable. Pruitt, her voice at the nurse's station on my third Monday, just under the threshold of carrying past the station, calibrated for the nurse's station and not for the rooms. She had that calibration down. She could wound you precisely within a radius she controlled. The pain scale documentation for rooms 408 through 412 is incomplete from last night. 3 entries missing. 2 entries, I said. 408 and 411. 410 was completed at 03:15. The timestamp is in the system. She looked at the screen. She did not apologize. The protocol is 2-hour intervals, she said. Not 2-hour intervals plus or minus 20 minutes. Mr. Hector in 409 went into acute post-surgical distress at 02:40, I said. I was with him for 40 minutes. The surrounding entries reflect the response and recovery window. The documentation explains the gap. What it explains, Sandra said, and her voice had shifted now to the specific register, is that you're still learning how this floor works, which is fine. But after 8 months, she looked at me the way people look when they are delivering a thing they have been carrying for a while. After 8 months, I would have expected a better adaptation curve. She closed the screen. Get the outstanding entries completed before handoff. I completed the entries. I said nothing. I did not say the thing I was thinking, which was that the 03:15 entry was in the system, and the system was accurate, and the documentation explained the gap, and that 11 years at Hargrove Memorial did not constitute a superior understanding of orthopedic nursing so much as an exclusive understanding of orthopedic nursing at Hargrove Memorial specifically, which is a narrower thing. I did not say this because it was true but not useful, and I had learned in 16 years of Army hospital nursing under conditions that included 3 deployments to theater, that the difference between what is true and what is useful is one of the most important calculations a person in my position can make. I went back to work. There was a veteran in room 449 who had been there for 4 days following a bilateral knee replacement, a man named Gerald Hooper, 68, 22 years Army infantry, the kind of man who had learned to manage pain by treating it as information rather than experience, which is a useful orientation in the field and a complicating factor in post-surgical recovery. He had not been sleeping. I knew this because I had checked on him twice between my scheduled rounds and had found him awake both times, looking at the ceiling with the particular watchfulness of a person who has trained himself to remain alert in the dark. I sat with him for 12 minutes on my third visit, which was 4 minutes longer than my schedule permitted, and which I had not told Sandra Kovacs about. 12 minutes in which I did not talk about his pain levels, or his ambulation targets, or his discharge timeline, but about Fort Benning in 1981, where he had done his basic training, and about a truck I had worked on with my father when I was 11 years old, which had nothing to do with anything except that he had mentioned trucks, and I had listened, and the listening had mattered more than the documentation in that specific 12 minutes. He slept after I left. I noted patient resting comfortably in the chart and moved on. Sandra would have flagged the entry as insufficiently clinical. She would have been technically right. I had stopped being interested in being technically right in the way Sandra meant it sometime around my second deployment, when I had learned that the space between the technically right thing and the right thing was where most of the actual work happened. I had been carrying that gap for 8 months, and I was tired of it. In 5 days, I told myself during the walk to the supply room, this was going to resolve itself one way or another. Either I was going to have the conversation with Sandra Kovacs that I had been not having for 8 months, or the floor was going to continue managing me as a variable until my 1-year review, at which point the Hargrove Memorial Nursing Administration would assess whether I had achieved sufficient adaptation curve and decide accordingly. I had no particular preference between these outcomes. I was simply tired, in the specific way of someone who has been trying to fit into a shape that was not made for her, and who has been at it long enough to know the shape is not going to change. I was in the supply room organizing wound care materials on a Tuesday afternoon when I heard the elevator doors. I heard them because the orthopedic floor had that carpet, that domestic quiet, and sound traveled differently here than on other floors, arrived earlier, carried further, resolved into something identifiable before it should have been identifiable. What I heard was not the elevator doors. It was the sound after the elevator doors, a footfall in the carpeted corridor that I registered in the back of my neck before I registered it in my ears, because some sounds are received by the body at a frequency below language. I had not heard that footfall in 4 years. I set down the wound care materials. And then I walked to the supply room door and looked into the corridor. He was in civilian clothes, khakis, a plain blue button-down, the kind of deliberate ordinary that senior officers in non-uniform environments sometimes wear, which is to say the clothes were ordinary, and everything else about him was not. He was 60 or so, upright in the way of men who have maintained their physical discipline past the point where maintaining it is automatic, and he was walking the length of the orthopedic corridor with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who has located a destination and is moving toward it without requiring anyone's permission to do so. He had not seen me yet. I stayed in the supply room doorway. He reached the nurse's station. Sandra Kovacs was at the station. Sandra was always at the station at 11 on a Wednesday. It was where she did her mid-morning documentation. He stopped. He looked at her with the direct, undemanding attention of someone who is about to ask a question he already knows the answer to. "I'm looking for one of your nurses," he said. "Diane Pruitt. Is she on shift today?" Sandra looked up from her screen. She had the expression she wore for visitors who arrived without context. Professionally receptive, faintly assessing. "Can I ask what this is regarding?" He looked at her for a moment, not impatiently. Just with the quality of a man who has answered the question of his authority so many times and in so many rooms that the question itself has stopped registering as a real question. "I'd like to speak with her," he said. "I was told she works this floor." Sandra looked at her screen again. "If you want to leave a name, I can let her know. James Aldridge," he said. "Colonel, United States Army, retired." He said the last word with the flat precision of a man for whom retirement is a status and not an identity. "Miss Pruitt knows who I am. If she's on the floor, I'd appreciate 5 minutes." Sandra said she would check. I was already walking down the corridor. I want to be careful about this next part because it is the part that people will not believe, and I want to tell it in the order that it happened rather than the order that would make it most dramatic, because the dramatic order would make it sound like a story, and it was not a story. It was a Wednesday morning in a carpeted corridor, and a man I had last seen in a field hospital at Bagram Airfield was standing at the nurse's station asking for me by name. And I had not seen him in 4 years, and I had not expected to see him, and the last thing I had said to him 4 years ago was that I hoped he would be able to walk without the cane by the following summer. And I did not know until this moment whether that had happened. He turned when I was about 12 feet away. He looked at me in the way that people look when they have traveled some distance to find a specific person and have found them. He was not using a cane. I stopped. He looked at me, and then he did something I had not specifically anticipated, which is that his face, The control, disciplined face of a man who has spent 40 years managing what his face does in front of other people, simply let go of something it had been holding. "There she is," he said. Not to me. To the corridor, to the station, to Sandra Kovacs, who was watching from behind the glass, to the two nurses who had appeared from bay rooms at the sound of a visitor, to Gerald Hooper, who had opened the door of 414 and was standing in the doorframe in his hospital gown, because he had heard a voice in the corridor that had the register of someone important. He said it to all of them, and it was quiet, and it landed like something that did not require amplification to reach every corner of the wing. "That's Diane Pruitt," he said. "That woman saved my whole unit." The floor went still. Carpeted still. The kind that fills from the edges inward. Sandra had stopped typing. The two nurses had stopped moving. Gerald Hooper, in the doorframe of 414, was standing straight in a way that post-bilateral knee replacement patients are not supposed to stand. And his face had the expression of a man who has just had something confirmed that he had suspected for 8 months. I walked the remaining 12 feet. "Sir," I said. "Pruitt." He extended his hand, and I took it. And his grip was the grip I remembered. Not demonstrative, just complete, the handshake of a man who means it fully and does not need to perform the meaning. He held it for a moment longer than a professional handshake requires. "You look well. You're walking without the cane," I said. "Since February," he said. 2 years ago, February. Something moved across his face. "I owe you a conversation I've been trying to have for 4 years. You transferred out of Bagram before I could. And then you were at Landstuhl, and then you were stateside, and—" He stopped. Started again more simply. "I've been looking." Sandra Kovacs had come out from behind the glass. She was standing at the edge of the station with her tablet, and her face had the expression I had identified on our first week and had been watching recalibrate in real time since Colonel Aldridge said 4 words into her corridor. The expression was not guilt. Exactly. Sandra was not a person who moved easily toward guilt. It was something adjacent to it. The specific look of a person who has been operating on a set of assumptions that have just been publicly revised, and who is processing the revision in front of witnesses, which is the least comfortable version of that process. Colonel Aldridge looked at Sandra. He looked at her the way senior officers look at situations they have assessed and decided to address directly. He had not come here to make a scene. He had come here to find me. The scene was incidental, and he was going to handle it with the same precision he brought to everything else. "I don't know how long Miss Pruitt has been on this floor," he said, "but I'd like to tell you something about what she did." Sandra said nothing. The corridor said nothing. Gerald Hooper, still standing in the door of 414 with considerably more dignity than a man in a hospital gown has any right to, said nothing. And then Colonel Aldridge told them. He told them about the forward operating base in Kunar province in 2018. He told them about the Eid strike that took out the lead vehicle of a patrol, and the secondary strike that was the reason the first strike happened, and the 11 men who were down in a 400-meter radius when the dust cleared. He told them about a combat nurse from the surgical support attachment who was not supposed to be at that grid reference and who was there because she had been tracking the patrol's route on the base medical net and had heard the first strike and had already been moving toward the sound before anyone had called for medical support. He told them about the tourniquet applied in darkness, about the airway managed without equipment that should have been present and was not, about the man with the chest wound and the fractured orbit, and the internal bleed who was still alive because of decisions made in the first 4 minutes by someone who did not wait to be asked and did not stop to confirm authorization and did not once in the 90 minutes between the strike and a medevac extraction. Do anything other than exactly what was needed, in exactly the order it was needed. He told them that 11 men had been down. He told them that 11 men had made it to the medevac. And then he stopped talking for a moment, not for effect, but because he was a man who had been carrying that number for 6 years, and who understood that the number required a pause around it. He said, "In 40 years of service, I have been in a lot of rooms where someone made a decision that changed the outcome. I have not been in a room, before or since, where one person's decisions changed 11 outcomes in 90 minutes. He paused. He looked at Sandra Kovacs with the direct, undemanding attention he had given her when he arrived. I don't know how this nurse fits on your floor, but I know what she is. And I wanted you to know it too." Sandra's tablet was at her side. She had stopped holding it the way she held it when she was using it as a professional object, and was simply holding it now, which was a thing I had not seen Sandra Kovacs do in 8 months. She looked at me, and what was in her face was not the assessment I had received for 8 months. Not the variable, not the transfer, not the insufficient adaptation curve. It was the specific expression of a person who has been carrying an understanding of someone that has just been entirely replaced, and who is deciding, in real time, how to hold the new understanding. She did not apologize in the corridor. Sandra Kovacs was not a corridor apology person, and I would not have respected it if she had been. She did something more useful, which was to look at me steadily and nod once. The nod of a person who is telling you, without words, that they have received the information, and that the information will change something, and that this is all that needs to be said in front of everyone present. I received it that way. Colonel Aldridge stayed for 40 minutes. I took my break early. Sandra told me to take my break early, which was the first discretionary act of latitude she had extended to me in 8 months, and which I accepted without comment. We sat in the small family consultation room adjacent to the nursing station, and he told me that 9 of the 11 were still active duty. That one had medically separated with a rating that let him keep his benefits. That the last one had died of causes unrelated to the strike, in his sleep, at home in Georgia, the previous spring, and that his family knew what had happened and had asked Aldridge to say so if he ever found the nurse who had been at that grid reference. I took that in. I held it the way you hold things that are too large to file immediately, carefully, with both hands, knowing that the right place for it will become clear when it becomes clear, and that trying to file it in the wrong place is worse than simply holding it. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Thank you for being findable," he said. He looked at me for a moment. "How is it?" The civilian side. I thought about the right answer to that. "I'm learning a different kind of attention," I said. He looked at me with the understanding of a man who has made that transition himself and knows what it costs and what it gives back. "That's a good answer," he said. "It's the true one," I said. He left at 11:40. I walked him to the elevator. Sandra was at the station and watched us go without saying anything, which meant she was giving me the corridor, and I registered that and was grateful for it. At the elevator, he shook my hand again, the same complete grip, and said that he would be in touch, and I said that I hoped so, and the elevator doors closed and he was gone. I stood in the carpeted corridor for a moment. Just a moment. 11 men. 90 minutes. All 11 to the medevac. These were numbers I had carried for 6 years and had not told anyone at Hargrove Memorial because there was no form for them, no box in the previous experience section, no place in the civilian hospital culture for the specific weight of a thing that happened in Kunar province in 2018 and that had been determining the shape of every room I had walked into since. And then I went back to the station. Sandra was at her screen. She looked up when I came in. She looked at me for a moment with the expression I had seen forming in the corridor, the revised understanding settling into the person who was holding it. "The entries for 408 through 412 from last night," she said. "Completed this morning," I said. "I saw." She was quiet for a moment. Then, the documentation on Mr. Hector's distress response. The sequence was correct. She paused. The gap made sense when I read the full entry. I looked at her. "Yes," I said. "It did." She nodded. She went back to her screen. It was not forgiveness, and it was not friendship. It was something more durable than either of those things, which was accuracy. The floor now held an accurate understanding of who I was, and I could feel the difference between the floor I had walked for 8 months and the floor I walked back to now. Not easier, not softer, but more correctly calibrated. A room that is the right size for the person who is in it. I went to check on Gerald Hooper, who was back in bed because bilateral knee replacements do not permit extended standing in door frames, regardless of how straight a man wants to be when he hears a colonel speak. He was awake. He looked at me with the eyes that had seen 8 decades of watching and had developed, as I had noted on his first night, very strong opinions about what he saw. "Kunar Province," he said. "Yes, sir, 12 men out?" 11 down, I said. 11 to the medevac." He was quiet for a moment, working through the arithmetic of what that meant. Then he made a sound, not words, just a sound, the specific low sound of a man who has been in enough bad situations to understand the full weight of a good outcome in one of them. "All right," he said. "All right." I checked his chart. I checked his incision sites. I adjusted the elevation of his left leg by 2 degrees, which was within his target range, and which he would not have mentioned needing, but which I could see in the angle of his hip that he did need. He said nothing about the adjustment, which was how he said thank you. I went back to the corridor. I picked up my clipboard, the one with the pain scale documentation for rooms 408 through 412, completed, accurate, time-stamped correctly. The gap explained. And I began my afternoon rounds. Room by room, patient by patient, the carpet muffling everything to a domestic quiet. The station glassed and lit at the center of the wing, the sound of a floor that now held the right amount of information about the person walking it. I still have work to do here. That has not changed. What has changed is the size of the room I am doing it in. If this one found you somewhere real, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that what you carry is not invisible, even when it feels that way. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of the people who showed up when it mattered and kept showing up after. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see where Ruth's story reaches. Let me know where you're watching from tonight.